con recursos y auspicios de la Facultad de Humanidades de la Universidad de Santiago de Chile. Y hasta ahora, las charlas que han sido objeto de este ciclo han sido en español. But today, we're gonna take a little spin here, and we're gonna have our first non-Spanish based master lecture in this series. And trust me when I say that there is no better way to inaugurate the English side of this series than with a talk by none other than Dr. Michael Allman. So I'll just give a few introductory words and a brief account of his massive and stellar CV. Dr. Allman is professor in the Department of Neuroscience at Georgetown University, with secondary appointments in the departments of neurology and psychology. He is director of the Brain and Language Laboratory and the Georgetown EEG-ERP Lab, and director of medical neuroscience at Georgetown University Medical School. He teaches undergraduate, master's, PhD, and medical students. His research examines the neurocognition of first and second language, math, reading, and memory, how these domains are affected in various disorders, for example, autism, dyslexia, developmental language disorder, aphasia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and Huntington's diseases, and how they may be modulated by factors such as genetic variability, sex, handedness, and aging. And I've had the pleasure of taking a deep dive into the work of Professor Allman's throughout the years, and trust me, you're in for a ride here. In particular, Michael will be talking about the contributions of learning and memory brain circuits to first and second language. So it is a true pleasure and a complete honor to have you here with us. Michael, the floor is all yours.
Okay, let me see. Thank you very much for that really nice introduction, Adolfo. It's also been a pleasure getting to know you and starting to work with you a little bit so far. So let me share my screen and make sure this works. We didn't test this already. So far, can you see it? Yes, okay, let me get rid of this.
Perfect.
Hide video panel. Hide. Floating, that's what I want. It's not, I don't want the hide video panel, actually. Show video panel, there we go, and hide. Footing. All right, I think we're all set. All right, you can hear me, everything's set? Good. Okay.
Perfect.
So as Adolfo said, the title of my talk is Contributions of Learning and Memory Brain Circuits to First and Second Language. And the main point of the talk, okay, the take-home message, if you will, is that increasing evidence suggests that the learning, representation, and processing of both first and second language in somewhat different ways depend importantly on two evolutionarily ancient and well-studied learning and memory brain circuits. Let me change my pointer to laser so you can see it better. And because we know a lot about these brain circuits, we can make quite a few predictions about first and second language that we might not be able to make in the more limited study of language alone. So it's a very powerful approach. Okay. In the talk, I'll first explain the motivations for and the approach of this research program, then talk about these two memory brain circuits, declarative memory and procedural memory in some depth, as well as how they interact. Then, based on this understanding of declarative and procedural memory, I will present predictions for language based on this independent knowledge of the memory circuits. How should they be involved in language? And then we'll look at evidence, okay, for in first and second language, as well as language disorders. This is highly collaborative work, and here are most, not all, of my collaborators, my funders.
Michael, just 1 second. Can everybody hear Michael right now? Can you hear Michael? At the auditorium, can everybody listen to Michael?
Raise your hand again if you can hear me.
Yes, please raise your hands if you can listen to my mic right now. Oh, okay, okay. Oh, good. Sorry.
Is it clear? Can you hear me clearly? All right, good. Okay, so I should continue. Okay. Yeah, Adolfo, should I continue? Yeah, okay. Okay, so this is highly collaborative work, and I would encourage the students among you and junior faculty to collaborate a lot. You get to meet interesting people, you are very productive, you learn a lot. So definitely collaborations are good, okay? And it's very productive. So first, let's talk about one slide, the motivation and approach of this. Okay, got rid of that. Of this research program. So evolution and biology tend to reuse existing mechanisms or structures for new functions. So for example, scales like you have in reptiles, right? They evolved into feathers, right? Feathers didn't come from nowhere. In fact, feathers were originally for regulating temperature, for thermal regulation, okay? And then they evolved into flight. Fins in fish evolved into limbs and wings and hands. And in one of my favorite examples, the wing may be used to shade prey. There's certain species of heron like this that spread their wings when they're hunting their prey, the fish and the frogs that they're after. And it's thought they're doing this so they can shade the water and better see the frogs and the fish. So they're using existing structure, the wings with no structural adaptations whatsoever, for an entirely new function. Okay, so this is the way that evolution and biology work. It's called co-optation. So given this principle of co-optation or reuse or hijacking an existing mechanism or structure for a new function, we should expect that that should be true for language as well. That is, we should expect that language should depend importantly on pre-existing brain circuits, whether or not they have then become more specialized for language, either developmentally in each individual or evolutionarily. Okay? And we simply focus on two circuits in the brain, declarative memory and procedural memory, since language, all or most of language has to be learned, okay? And these are arguably the two most important learning and memory circuits in the brain, okay? So it's very simple, straightforward logic. In the talk, this declarative memory will be in this green color on this side, and procedural, I mean this red color on this side to make it easier for you. Okay, and this is the essence of what we call the declarative procedural or DP model of language. Quite simply that these two memory circuits have been co-opted for language, and so language depends on them in various ways. Our approach is to test if this is true. So if and how various aspects of language depend on these circuits. That's the entire research program. Okay, and of course we can do this in many ways, as we'll see. And as I mentioned briefly in the introductory slide, it's a very powerful approach. So from both human and animal studies, right? So you can do animal work, right? Looking at language indirectly, right? Okay, mostly rodents and non-human primates, monkeys. We know a lot about these circuits: computation, developmental, anatomic, endocrine, genetic, and so on. So based on this independent knowledge, okay, we can make specific, novel, testable predictions about language that there might be no reason to make in the limited study of language alone. So most of us study language. Well, here we're saying, well, if language depends on these well-studied systems, everything we know about them may be true for language, and we can test that. So it's an extremely powerful approach, okay, all these different levels, right? That doesn't mean it's right. I always like to remind listeners, particularly more junior scientists and students, that most of what we do is wrong, particularly for more complex systems like we study, right? The brain and the mind. So that's not just a question of, experiments that can't be replicated, but most hypotheses and theories are partially, if not completely wrong. Or we characterize it one way and we should characterize it a different way, right? So the blind man and the elephant a little bit. So we have to keep in mind, so probably most of this idea is wrong, but as you'll see, there's something that seems a little bit right about it. Okay, so in this slide, I will present declarative memory. This is just background, like what is declarative memory? Okay, not about language. The next slide about procedural memory, and the third slide after this, some ways in which these two memory circuits interact with each other. Then we'll look at predictions for language based on this understanding of memory systems, and then we'll look at evidence for language. So what is declarative memory? We define it in our research program as having an anatomical basis. So it's the learning and memory that rely on the hippocampus and associated circuitry. And we'll define down here, you'll see, I'll tell you what the hippocampus is. Okay? Although most of you have probably heard of it. Adolfo and also the audience, I tend to speak quickly even for a native English speaker. Is this okay? Can you understand me? Okay. Declarative memory is found in other vertebrates, mammals, like rats and rodents and monkeys, but also even in birds, for example. And it helps birds remember where they put their acorns, as an example. It's often characterized as knowledge for what? So person experienced events, episodic memory or episodic knowledge, like what did I have for dinner last night, right? Or facts, okay, semantic knowledge, okay, or semantic memory. So for example, I love geography. So like, what's the capital of Zimbabwe, right? So the capital of Zimbabwe is Harare, okay? And so that's just a fact, okay? This system may be specialized and might even be necessary for learning arbitrary bits of information and associating them, like Harare, Zimbabwe. But it's very flexible and it can learn just about anything, okay? And that's important. Learning is very rapid in the system. If you didn't know what the capital of Zimbabwe is, now you might know, right? What's the capital? Anybody? Harare. Processing, recall of knowledge and declarative memory is often effortful, like maybe effortful to pull out Harare just now. And retention is okay, it's not great. So you might forget Harare by tomorrow or next week or next year, if you didn't know. Consolidation, which can be thought of as like the stabilization of learned knowledge, seems to be promoted by sleep rather than by time, which is more the case for procedural memory. Knowledge learned in declarative memory can be either explicit, that is available to conscious awareness, conscious of it, or implicit, not available to conscious awareness. However, this is a little confusing sometimes for people, okay? It's the only memory system underlying explicit knowledge. So if you have explicit knowledge, it must have been learned. We think it must have been learned in declarative memory. And we know something about the developmental trajectory of declarative memory. Learning in the system is pretty bad early on. You don't remember much from when you were 2 years old, right? It improves during childhood. It seems to be at its best kind of plateaus in adolescence and early adulthood, and then it's all downhill. So if you're past your early 20s, that's it. It's all downhill from there, especially in old age. So it goes like this. It goes, so in old age, it goes really down. Okay? How about the functional neuroanatomy? So functional neuroanatomy means what parts of the brain do what functions, right? So declarative memory is rooted in the hippocampus and other medial temporal lobe structures, which underlie together the learning and memory of new knowledge, basically learning new stuff, okay? So here we see the brain. This is the middle of the brain, okay? So basically facing this way, the same direction of the brain, and then taking off the left hemisphere. This is the middle of the brain. Basically, you're seeing the right hemisphere. So it's medial, lateral, and medial, to use these anatomical terms that make sense anyway, right? And so the hippocampus is this sort of green thing, and these other structures around it, like entorhinal and perirenal cortex that I'll mention. Okay. Within these structures, the hippocampus is particularly important for learning associations, for binding stuff together, like Harare with Zimbabwe, and for recollection, what's often called recollection in this literature, recalling Harare from Zimbabwe. Rhinal cortex, meaning entorhinal and especially perirenal cortex, is more important for learning items, like maybe the word Harare. And rather than consciously recalling it, more from familiarity. Harare, that sounds familiar. Or I've seen you somewhere before, so that's familiarity. And also as a gatekeeper for learning, like, oh, do we know this already? If not, let's learn it. If I do know it, I don't need to learn it. Okay. So we know quite a lot about this, right? Neocortex, which is basically the rest of the brain. Okay, as Spanish speakers, you know what, I guess the bark of a tree is what's corteza, is that right? Okay, so in French, it's ecos. I speak French, not really Spanish. So cortex in Latin means bark or rind. So it's basically the bark on the outside of the brain. Okay, so the rest of the outside of the brain is what's called neocortex. And especially in the temporal lobe, so here, this is the temporal lobe, this occipital, temporal, parietal, and frontal. So this is temporal down here, temporal neocortex, and here it is too. Okay, underlies the long-term storage. So not just the learning, which is in this hippocampus and nearby structures, but the long-term storage. After something that's called systems consolidation, which basically means with sleep, right, consolidation, the change of reliance of knowledge from the medial temporal lobe to neocortex, and that takes place with sleep. Okay? And this is a network of structures, not just this or this. And so frontal regions, such as Brodmann's area 45, 47, underlie recall of knowledge, perhaps in conjunction with the hippocampus. And finally, I don't know, given since your background's not so much neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience, if you've heard of the ventral stream, it's kind of widely talked about, basically allows you to sort of understand objects when you're seeing them or listening to them, to identify objects. This also underlies what type knowledge, okay, just like this, and also depends on temporal lobe circuits. And it seems that what's happening is declarative memory learns the knowledge that's then processed by the ventral stream. And again, this may be less something that you guys make sense to you or is relevant to what you think about. And then finally, we understand something about the molecular substrates. So we know what some of the neurotransmitters underlying declarative memory is, such as acetylcholine. The hormone estrogen plays a particularly important role. Okay, picture of one of the estrogen molecules. And this may help explain why females tend to be better than males at declarative memory. And we also know a lot about the genetics or many genes that affect declarative memory. Remember, genes just make proteins. If you didn't know that, now you do. That's all they do. Okay. And so, for example, proteins BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, you don't need to know that, or ApoE, apolipoprotein A. There are versions of these genes. Some of you have one version, some of you have another version, okay, based on little changes in the DNA and the gene, the DNA for the gene. And some of you have one version of the gene or another version, okay? And those of you with one version of the BDNF gene actually have bigger hippocampi and better declarative memory than the others, and same for ApoE, different versions, okay? So that's pretty cool. And there are many more genes we have this kind of knowledge of, okay? You can see how this is a lot of stuff we know about declarative memory that could apply to language, right? Like we know nothing about the genetics of language, right? So this is pretty cool, right? And here's some pictures of those genes, of those proteins. Procedural memory, okay? What is it? First, we define it as, again, neuroanatomically based as the learning and memory that rely on the basal ganglia associated circuitry instead of the hippocampus for declarative memory or medial temporal lobe. It's also found in other vertebrates. Okay, for example, it helps rats follow rule-governed grooming sequences, the order in which they clean themselves. Sequence. Right? It's often characterized as knowledge for how, not the what, like declarative memory, but how. So learning motor and cognitive skills like learning to bicycle, to bike, or perceptual motor sequences, so like tapping things in sequence. You'll see that that's something that's well studied. A task called the serial reaction time task, if you may be familiar with. We'll talk a bit about later. Learning sequence, learning categories as well, rules, and particularly studied in rats is route learning. So if you put the rat in a cross maze like this from the top view, right, and you reward the rat for always turning in one direction, so right in this case, it's going to learn to automatically turn in this direction. So it goes in, turns, and you just get rewarded. It's rewarded. That's learning the basic ganglia. That's procedural memory. Okay, so that's an example, okay, of route learning. And in fact, it may be specialized for learning to predict, especially with rapid feedback. So when the rat goes in and it predicts, oh, I'll get a reward if I turn right, it gets the reward immediately. That's how the basal ganglia learns. I'm going to get a reward. It gets better and better and better. Or in a sequence of events or of items, if you predict what the next item is and then the item occurs, that constitutes feedback, that very presence of that item, or if it's wrong, the absence of the item. Learning is gradual. You don't learn to ride a bicycle right away. But eventually, skills or habits, what you're learning in procedural memory, become rapid and reliable, what's called automatized. And you don't really forget how to ride a bicycle. Retention of the system seems to be excellent. Consolidation, remember consolidation, that is stabilizing newly learned knowledge, in this case skills, seems to be promoted by time rather than by sleep, as is the case for declarative memory. And knowledge learned in procedural memory seems to be implicit only, so not available to conscious words. You don't know how you ride a bike, just write it, right? You're not aware consciously of how you do it. And finally, the developmental trajectory of learning is understood. Learning is pretty good when you're young, okay? And then it decreases during childhood, adolescence. So this is probably why, for example, you have to learn a musical instrument young or become a gymnast very young in order to become excellent, right? And then it's kind of stable or decreases, but not as much as declarative memory. It's more stable. Functional neuroanatomy of procedural memory. What parts of the brain do what? So this system is rooted in the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia. Okay, the basal ganglia are a set of structures deep in the brain. So this is deep inside the brain. Okay, the two most important structures arguably are the putamen, which is this one, and the caudate nucleus, which is this one, this long thing here. Okay, and those together are called the striatum. And the anterior, the more part in front of these two structures, the anterior striatum. So basically, this part of the caudate nucleus, this part of the putamen, are involved in learning and processing new knowledge. So learning a new skill, that's what these do, this part right here, okay? In contrast, when a skill is really well learned, it depends on neocortex, right? Remember, neocortex is like cortex, corteza, right? Is the outside of the brain, particularly in the parietal lobe and frontal lobe, especially what's called the premotor regions, which is kind of right here, okay? So this is involved in processing automatai skills after system consolidation, after that knowledge becomes somewhat independent of here and more dependent on neocortex. And this procedural memory seems to be, it's a little less clear than declarative memory with the what stream, the ventral stream, but this procedural memory seems to be linked with the dorsal stream, okay, which is basically how you do something, okay? How you reach for something, okay? Also involves how and parietal frontal circuits, and it may be, we've argued that procedural memory is basically learning those circuits, right? It's linking this to this, okay? We also know something about the molecular substrates of procedural memory. The neurotransmitter dopamine is particularly important, and it's actually quite well studied how it actually underlies learning. It's prediction-based learning at the molecular level even, okay? And again, like think about what we know about language versus this, right? How much we can predict about language, pretty cool. And we know something about the genes. The famous, language gene, FOXP2, you may have heard of, that actually has a strong role in procedural memory and various dopamine-related genes as well. All right, finally, the last slide on the memory systems before we go to predictions about language based on what we know about the memory systems. So here, the last slide of the memory systems is how they interact. First, we'll look at what sometimes people call cooperative interaction. We think about in terms of redundant mechanisms, okay, that the two systems are redundant for each other. So some things we learn, some tasks and functions seem to be learnable only by one or the other circuit. So declarative memory seems necessary for learning arbitrary bits of information in their relations, like Harare is the capital of Zimbabwe. You really can't learn that any other way except for in declarative memory, okay? Less clear for procedural memory, but it might be necessary for learning motor skills to the point of automatization. However, that's the main point here. However, other tasks and functions, and I think it's going to be the majority of higher level cognitive stuff we do, can be learned by both systems, that is by either system, but generally different ways by the two systems. So take route learning, navigation. Remember, oops, wrong direction. Remember how I showed you this, that learning by always turning in one direction depends on procedural memory, the basal ganglia. This is called response learning, okay? Response learning, okay? But there's another way that rats and humans can learn to navigate, by landmarks. So if Adolfo's face is on the wall here, so this is a maze in a room, Adolfo's face is here, of course the rat's gonna think, oh, cool, let's go towards Adolfo. It goes towards Adolfo, right? That kind of learning towards a landmark, okay, depends on the hippocampus, and that's called place learning. And here's something really fun, okay? How do you test for this? You turn the maze around in the room. So if they're still turning towards Adolfo, now they're going to turn to this side. They're still going to turn to this side, but now it's actually not turning right, but turning left, right? Whereas if they are automatically turning right, they'll now go to this direction. It's pretty cool. It's a very, very simple test that people who study rodents use. Okay. And this notion, so you can navigate using two different ways in two different systems, right? It's pretty cool, right? And this is pretty well studied in humans as well, and primates for sequences, categories, rules, like learning a sequence explicitly, for example, versus implicitly procedural. And finally, various variables, factors, influence, affect which system is relied on more for those things, like root learning or sequences or categories. That can be learned in either system. Like what pushes that learning to one or the other, right? So input. Okay, input level, the amount of input. Do you guys think, anybody, you think less input favors declarative or procedural memory? Someone. Let's pretend that we're alive here. Okay, raise your hand if you think that less input pushes learning towards declarative memory. Anybody raise their hand? Okay, Adolfo is right. He gets an A+. All right. Too bad you don't need that anymore.
I was thinking that just by placing my face on that maze, I mean, it would be an aversion paradigm.
That's right. That's a whole other topic. So the reason why less input rather than more input favors declarative versus procedural with more input is because declarative memory learns much faster than procedural memory. So just right away, you've learned a declarative, a sequence or something, whereas procedural memory takes more time. Or the type of input matters. So explicit input, of course, will favor declarative memory. The absence might relatively favor procedural memory. Or feedback. I told you before that fast feedback favors learning or is important for learning in procedural memory. Well, it turns out there's a whole literature. Slow feedback or no feedback actually then correspondingly favors learning in declarative memory. Also the subject level. So if Adolfo is better than me at declarative memory, which one of these will he favor? He'll favor for doing these things, right? He'll favor declarative memory. If I'm better at procedural, I'll tend to, it's like depends on which hand you use, the stronger hand. It's a very nice by analogy, right? So then you find individual and group differences. So for example, for sex, so females tend to be better at declarative memory. They depend more on that system. Or depending on the gene, certain versions of the gene might favor declarative or procedural more or less. And so you might have shifting, you should expect shifts of that sort. And then finally at the item level, you might have frequent combinations, which are memorized as chunks. That's actually easier to explain in that language. Like if you have walk and ED or the cat, if they keep on occurring, then you might just learn them in declarative memory as a big unit. Okay. And then I'll talk less about this today, but it is relevant. And actually, I'm getting more into this, some of my work. There's a competitive interaction between the two memory systems. We call the seesaw effect. How do you say seesaw in Spanish? Actually, I don't know. Like balance.
Yeah, I mean, what you're showing there is sub y baja. Yeah, but I'm not. That's how we call it in Argentina. I would not presume to know how they call it in Chile. So,
so according to this effect, the predominance of one system has more, stronger because it's learned more, like it's learned, more earlier on for declarative memory, for example, can block or inhibit the other. Okay, and it's not really understood how this happens. We're writing a paper on this now, actually. Or, for example, the dysfunction of one system may enhance the functionality of the other. So if you cut off my right arm, now my left arm will actually get stronger. Okay, is it because it's used more? It's because there's a direct connection? We don't know yet. Both. Estrogen not only enhances declarative memory, as I said, but also there's some evidence that it inhibits procedural memory. So this is a very cool effect, which can make things complicated. Like, oh, I'll learn first the second language in this one. Yeah, but that might block it. So, it gets a bit tricky. Okay, I often get questions like that. All right, so now the next 3 slides will look at predictions for language based on what I just told you. That is this independent knowledge of the 2 memory systems and how they interact. Okay. So this is really important. Like, well, this is kind of the essence of the model of the theoretical framework. What can we tell about language based on this knowledge? This slide, I'll just say what aspects of language the circuits underlie. And then the next two slides will be other things, other types of predictions. So we should expect that here are the predictions, right? The learning and processing of lexical or word knowledge depend heavily on declarative memory, but also in certain ways, procedural memory. So anything idiosyncratic, arbitrary, remember, has to be learned in declarative memory, we think, right? So that should be all this stuff. By hypothesis, by prediction, really has to be learned here, right? So simple content, so open class words like verbs and nouns, like cat, unpredictable morphology, irregulars, like the fact that dig takes Doug as past tense, unpredictable stuff in syntax, complements, like the fact that devour in English requires a direct object. You can say I eat or I eat something. For devour, you have to say I devour something. It's just a fact of English, right? Probably, right? Or idioms or metaphors, right? That's so like the fact that in English, John kicked the bucket, that means John died. You can't derive that, you just have to know that, right? So it's just something you have to memorize. But one might expect that some aspects of procedural memory that also underlie certain aspects of the learning and processing of lexical knowledge. So word segmentation, this literature that's studied under the rubric of statistical learning, okay? So where basically you hear a bunch of and then you extract word forms out of that speech stream. That's implicit extraction of a word from the sequence. Okay? Sounds pretty procedural to me, and we'll see there is some evidence for that. Closed class items, it's not conscious, it's implicit, they depend on the structure. Okay, that might be procedural. And then something that's closely related to what Adolfo, one of the things Adolfo does is what might be called motor-related words like hammer. So one of the sources of knowledge of hammer, you have lots of knowledge about hammer, how it looks and who uses it, when you last used it, but one of them is how you use it, right? Well, that should have been learned in procedural memory, and therefore that aspect of knowledge should be procedural, okay? Even though it's related to actual lexical knowledge. In contrast, grammatical or rule knowledge might be expected to depend heavily on procedural memory, since it has these aspects that are quite like procedural memory. Sequences, even though they're hierarchical sequences, they involve categories, rules, prediction, right? Kind of sounds procedural to me, right? And you should expect that, one should expect that across different aspects of grammar. So syntax, like learning rules and then combining, for example. The or cat, or learning categories like noun phrase or verb phrase, and learning rules of how they are structured and actually doing the combination. In morphology, for regular, same thing, verb, ed, okay, learning that and then combining, and same for phonology, learning the phonotactics, the phonological grammar of the language, okay, and then maybe combining segments like phonemes or syllables. However, okay, I mentioned this before, maybe we can just memorize the cat, not combine it, but just memorize it as a big word, and same with walked. Okay, so that should be in declarative memory. We can learn rules explicitly, or maybe, since proceed to declarative memory underlies implicit knowledge as well, implicitly, like, oh, the comes before cat, for example, explicitly. Or this is a more fun one. I used to do much more work in this. Can generalize associatively in declarative memory. So if you memorize, this is fun, rode, flowed, stowed, like walked, balked, right? And then you see something like blow, okay? You'll say blowed because you're generalizing across the same pattern in memory. It's kind of cool. So it looks like a rule, but it's not a rule. It's actually an associative. You can even test for these things. And then finally, there are other aspects of language that should expect it to depend on these memory systems as well. Remember that anything learned might be expected to be learned in these memory systems, right? So most of my early work really looked at lexicon and grammar, but we're starting to look at these other things as well. So speech sound representations, phonemes, their categories, knowledge about them is implicit, they're learned gradually, it's by kids. But they can also be learned explicitly by second language learners, in which case they learn quickly, early, and they can be even speaker specific, which sounds very much like declarative, very specific. Right? Articulation is just a motor skill, so it should depend on procedural memory. And other aspects of speech production may also depend on procedural memory, such as predicting the tactile or auditory output when you're speaking, okay? Or in speech perception, you're constantly predicting what's going to be said next, right? So all these different aspects of language might depend on one and or the other system. That's really cool, right? So now the second slide on predictions is we're looking at what the characteristics and the neurobiology are for whatever aspects of language, whether it's grammar or lexicon or speech sound representation or learned in declarative memory and whatever is learned procedural. What should that look like? That knowledge, that language knowledge learned here or here. First, we'll just do something very intuitive, okay, not direct evidence, which is what are the characteristics? Well, aspects of language, whatever they are, learned in declarative memory should be learned via slow or no feedback. Learning should be quick, at least initially. Processing should be often effortful, right? Especially recall of that knowledge. Retention should be okay, not great. Knowledge should be explicit and implicit. Development should be learn it not very well early, should improve, peak, and then decline in old age. And there should be group effects, such as females more than males, and so on. Okay. Aspects of language, whatever they are, relying on procedural memory, should be learned via prediction with rapid feedback. Learning should be gradual. Processing should be eventually automatized. Knowledge should be excellent. Retention should be excellent. Knowledge should be implicit. And then in terms of development, you should learn pretty well early on in childhood, but then it may look like a critical period, right? Like for grammar, right? Because then you're not so good at learning procedural memory. And then in old age, it should be some decline, not much. How about the functional neuroanatomy? Remember what the functional neuroanatomy means? What parts of the brain do what? So the hippocampus. So we remember what we're doing is we're taking all this independent knowledge from the last few slides and saying, this is what we should expect from language. So the hippocampus should be involved in learning new associations in whatever this is in language. For example, in words, form meaning associations like cat and what it means, or recalling, like saying this is a cat, can you say it? Or hand, saying hand, recall. Rhinal cortex, meaning perirhinal and entorhinal cortex, should underlie learning items like maybe word forms. Right? Recognition of forms through familiarity. Look, I know that. Yeah, I've seen that before, but that's different than recalling it. We're gatekeeping for new learning. So if I give you a new word, right, like seesaw, okay, do I know this? Oh, I don't know it, I better learn it. And neocortex, especially in the temporal lobe, should underlie long-term knowledge of this sort, which should be part of ventral stream processing. In contrast, whatever aspects of language rely on procedural memory should depend on the anterior striatum, so the anterior caudate nucleus and putamen, for early learning, and that should connect inputs in parietal and frontal cortex. And in fact, that's where those neocortical regions, the parietal, frontal, premotor regions, circuits, is what should underlie the automatized skills, probably part of dorsal stream processing. So learning and then processing, learning and then processing. Estrogen should help you learn stuff in declarative memory. It might, through the seesaw effect, actually impede learning in procedural memory. Okay. Acetylcholine should help learning in declarative memory. Dopamine through prediction-based learning and procedural memory, and different versions of these genes for declarative or procedural may help you more or less in each case. And then the last slide for predictions is what influences which circuit is relied on for those aspects of language that can depend on either system. Most importantly, grammar is what we'll mostly talk about. Okay. Amount of input, remember that? Okay, that was my question that I don't feel correctly got an A+ for. So less input experience should result in a greater reliance on declarative memory. So early stages of learning language, right? Early in childhood for L1 or early learned L2. So this is L1 is first language, L2 is second language. Or lower experience L2, second language, even if you learn it as an adult, and vice versa. So more input experience at later stages of learning should increase reliance on procedural memory because it's getting stronger and stronger at it. That it becomes automatized and has precedence as a result, probably. So later during development, okay, or at higher experience, second language. The type I mentioned this before as well, of input experience matters. When there's no slow feedback, should increase reliance on declarative memory. Explicit instructed input should do the same thing. Or input emphasizing chunking. If I say the cat, the cat, the cat, the cat, you can learn that as a chunk. Okay? Or learning associations, like learning flowed, rode, stowed, so you can generalize that to bloat. In contrast, prediction with rapid feedback, like probably, we think, in immersion-like input. So when you're hearing me speak, you're making predictions about what I'm going to say next constantly, implicitly, and that's helping you learn in procedural memory. Whereas if in your classroom with explicit input, okay, you're going to learn more in declarative memory. And then this is a kind of fun one. So instead of saying the cat, the cat, the cat, if you say the desk, the cat, the tree, the microphone, then you're having the relationships more important than the chunk. And then finally, subject level differences in learning abilities, right? So basically, if you're better at declarative memory, you'll learn there. If you're better at procedural memory, you'll learn there. That's all this is, okay? So, you're better as an adolescent in declarative memory than a child, okay? Young adults, adolescents should rely more on declarative memory when learning, like a second language, right? If you have a problem with procedural memory, like we'll see with developmental language disorder, okay, or dyslexia, then, well, you're bad at this, you use this, okay? Maybe even the seesaw effect makes it even better. Or if you are very good at declarative memory, same thing. For example, if you're a female versus a male, if you have higher estrogen, or if you have these alleles, these versions of the genes that are better, associated with better declarative memory, and vice versa. So kids should learn more in procedural memory than young adults because they're better at procedural memory. If you have a declarative memory deficit, you'll shift over to procedural. If you're really good at procedural memory, you'll be better at that, and so you should rely more on that. Males versus females, perhaps, lower estrogen, perhaps, and different versions of genes that are associated with better procedural memory. All right, everybody stretch. Now we'll look at evidence. In all of our work, we seek converging evidence. Can someone in the audience raise their hand if they've heard the term converging evidence? Anybody in the audience? Adolfo. He's not in the audience, but it's okay. At least I can see him. So converging evidence basically is the idea that, if you hear about a fire, downtown, you're going to believe it if you get it from different sources, you smell it, you see it, you hear it, and so on. That's converging evidence. And then you believe it more. It's more likely to be true than if you hear it from one person, for example. It's the same in science, right? So every method, paradigm, and approach has both strengths and weaknesses, or different labs have biases. I have my biases towards my own theoretical framework. I'm sure he doesn't have biases, right? Okay. Yeah, exactly. So when you have evidence from many different sources, you're more likely to believe it. Okay. And that's why I had these predictions from many different sorts. So in the following slides, we'll look at converging evidence regarding the role of these two memory circuits in lexicon, words, in first and second language. That's one slide. That's the next slide. Grammar in first language, following slide. Grammar in second language, the third slide after this. And then a few slides on developmental disorders with a focus on developmental language disorder, which is mostly what we study. And then one slide on other topics, just briefly, and then one slide on new directions in reading and math. So lexicon. Do you think lexicon, everybody in the audience, can you hear me? Raise your hand if you can hear me. All right. Do you think that the evidence suggests lexicon depends more on declarative memory? Say yeah, raise your hand if it's yes. All right, some feedback, exactly. All right, so the evidence here, as you'll see, is that the lexicon depends much more on declarative memory than in procedural memory. Whereas the opposite, next slide, for grammar in first language. So first is looking at the characteristics. So this is not direct evidence. So open class content words have characteristics of declarative memory. So they're learned early when you're learning a language, in first and second language both. Recall of words is effortful, right? Or can be. Retention of words is only okay, it's not great. There's evidence that consolidation of words is sleep-based. Knowledge can be explicit, probably implicit for words. learning improves during childhood, seems to peak around adolescence and young adulthood, then declines, especially in old age. And there's some evidence that learning of words is better in females than males. In contrast, the characteristics of these, and I kind of said this before, are more like procedural memory, right? So word segmentation, so extracting this a new word from the speech stream, is gradual, is implicit, sequence-based, and closed class items are learned later compared to open class words, content words like nouns or verbs. Their use is automatized and knowledge about them is pretty implicit. Now let's look at direct evidence, okay? So let's go back to Adolfo and me. If Adolfo is better at declarative memory than me, who should, you in the audience, okay? It's hard to do this by Zoom when I see small faces, but who should be better at learning words? Is it Adolfo? Raise your hand if Adolfo should be better at learning words, if he's better at declarative memory. All right, get some feedback here. Excellent. So, whereas if Adolfo is better at procedural memory than me, shouldn't matter because learning words shouldn't depend much on procedural. So this is the kind of correlational evidence that I'm talking about here. And in fact, as you predicted, declarative lexical abilities correlate only with declarative memory, not procedural memory. So there are many studies that have been run like this, and we performed a meta-analysis of these studies. That is an analysis of the analyses of these studies, 10 studies, 39 correlations, 424 children. So it's kind of believable, right? That's the advantage of meta-analyses. Don't look at this side. That's grammar. That's the next slide. Just this side, okay? And so this is blue, is learning in declarative memory, tasks that test you in declarative memory learning. Red is tasks that test you in procedural memory, like this sequence learning task with fingers. And how good you are at learning in declarative memory correlates very strongly, large effect size, with how good you are at lexical abilities, like vocabulary or word retrieval. Whereas how good you are at procedural memory does not at all. So this really nicely ties learning lexical abilities to learning in declarative memory, but not learning in procedural memory. And then this is L1. And then a few months ago, we published a study, which is not a meta-analysis, but a systematic review. So we don't have these, we just have these ratios here. So of the 7 studies that looked at correlations between declarative memory and lexical abilities, 4, or about 60%, found correlations, whereas only 1 of 5, or 20%, found that for procedural memory. Again, this ties lexical abilities to declarative memory much more than procedural memory. Okay. So overall, this evidence is tying lexical abilities to declarative, but not procedural memory. And then we have brain-based evidence. So remember the functional neuroanatomy, that's what parts of the brain do what. So the lesion method is basically, if you have a hole in your head in a very specific part of the brain, what do you lose, right? If you cut off your hands, you stop, can you not grasp? That means that grasping depends on the hands. So people with so-called medial temporal lobe amnesics, that people with lesions in the medial temporal lobe, okay, I'll show you, I'll blow this picture up later, okay? They have problems with declarative memory. That's how declarative memory was actually discovered, particularly in this famous patient, HM, who died a few years ago, okay? They also have word learning deficits. So it ties word learning to the medial temporal lobe and to declarative memory. There are lots of neuroimaging studies that are relevant. That basically they tie the learning and processing of words to the medial temporal lobe, like hippocampus, like here, or the ventral stream, like here. And this is a neuroanatomical meta-analysis we published a couple of years ago. Electrophysiology. So who here has heard of event-related potentials or the N400 event-related potential? Anybody raise your hand in the audience? No? Okay.
They should all raise their hands because we did have specific lecture on electrophysiology. It might be that this has not become sufficiently consolidated, so maybe there's a lack of sleep here.
Yeah. Oh, so let me tell you guys, particularly you in the audience, there's something that we call the Matthew effect, which is the rich get richer. And basically the idea is for learning is the more you learn, the easier it is to learn, because the way learning works is, declarative memory at least, is you attach new information to existing information. So every time you get more information, like this talk, next time, if something is related to that or it's the same information, it'll be easier for you. Okay, so the more you learn, the more you learn. Okay? Just sort of helpful, so it's an optimistic view of learning. Okay? So if you have electrodes on the head, that's like eventuated potentials. If you then look at the electrical potentials after a particular event, like the presentation of a word, okay? And so what you find is that there's this event-related potential, ERP component at the top of the head, but actually it comes from medial temporal lobe for the most part. Okay, we're writing a paper on that right now, actually. So it's tied to declarative memory. Okay, and actually, I don't know if you might be interested in this. It's a bit more technical. Is that most people think of the N400 as a processing component, but we actually argue it's learning this unexpected stuff. Since you got it when if you have unexpected stuff, that's what you learn. So it's kind of cool. Okay, so
there's also this vision, that sort of challenges the traditional expectation-based interpretation of the N400. Sort of places the emphasis on access versus retrieval, and I'd like to pick your brain on that afterwards, but I don't want to interrupt.
Yep. So here is a picture of the lesions in HM, the famous medial temporal amnesic. Here's hippocampal activation in neuroimaging for word learning. Here's this activation in the ventral stream of the temporal lobe for word processing newly learned words. And here's an N400 that in fact is linked to the medial temporal lobe and declarative memory. But some aspects, remember I said, of lexical learning and processing actually depend on procedural memory, very specific aspects. So word segmentation, implicitly pulling out a word from the word stream, speech stream. That there's some evidence suggesting that actually depends on the anterior striatum neuroimaging. So it's procedural based. Closed class words depend on frontal basal ganglia structures, evidence from strokes or Parkinson's disease. And this is something that may particularly interest you, Adolfo. You may know this already. Maybe this part a little less. So motor words have been tied in neuroimaging to frontal parietal basal ganglia structures, among others, in neuroimaging and lesion studies with stroke. But also there's this beautiful double dissociation. Parkinson's patients have problems with procedural learning and with motor words, like hammer. Okay. In fact, we have a paper a couple of years ago showing that nicely, controlling for all kinds of stuff. And Tourette's, kids with Tourette's syndrome who also basal ganglia damage, but of a different sort, okay, they actually have enhanced, well, some evidence suggests they have enhanced procedural memory and enhanced processing of motor words in terms of speed. Very, very cool. Okay. And for those of you who are interested in this, a little bit more technical, Parkinson's disease is what's called a hypokinetic disorder. It can't move because of the way the circuitry is damaged in Parkinson's disease, whereas Tourette's can be thought of as a hyperkinetic disorder, so too much activity, which is probably why you're getting these effects. And then estrogen has been found to improve lexical memory and declarative in women. All right, first language, syntax and morphology. So the one-liner here is grammar in first language across syntax and morphology depends more here and only a little bit here. So first characteristics, these are learned late compared to words, processing is eventually automatized, retention seems to be very good, knowledge of grammar is largely implicit. However, there's some evidence that even in first language, aspects of grammar can depend on declarative memory. There's chunking very early in childhood. There's evidence in a number of studies, of mostly ours, that females chunk, memorize the cat or walked more than males in children, adults, and in people with procedural memory deficits like Parkinson's disease. So they're compensating with declarative memory by memorizing there. Okay, and they also have associative generalization that's been found in both Parkinson's disease and in children, more females than males, like saying, basically generalizing flowed, stowed, and rode to blowed. Correlation evidence, the exact same picture I showed you before, but now we're looking at this side, which shows that grammar correlates reasonably strongly at medium effect size with procedural memory, but only weakly with declarative memory. So here is procedural memory. Right? This is grammar on this side, child L1 grammar abilities. Okay, we'll look at second language grammar the next slide. Okay, and here's a medium effect size, tying grammar in children to procedural memory, and only a small effect size to declarative memory, consistent with this, right? But mostly to procedural. And then there's brain evidence, right? So frontal basal ganglia are in the lesion method are tied to grammar with stroke, or the same double dissociation I showed you, but now we're looking at grammar, right? Okay, rather than motor words. Okay. So Parkinson's, I said before, are worse at, are impaired at learning grammar, at procedural learning and at grammar, and Tourette's are actually better at both, not just at learning procedural memory, but also at processing grammar faster. Okay. Neuroimaging has tied grammar to frontal, including premotor regions, and left anterior negativity is a different event-related potential component. It's linked to grammar and procedural weakly. I'm much less confident about this than for the declarative memory side for N400s. Okay. And on this side, by the way, medial temporal and amnesics are spared on grammar. Okay, we have work learning problems, but they're spared, they seem to be spared on grammar. Estrogen improves retrieval of chunked forms in females, but may actually inhibit grammatical processing that are not of grammar, aspects of grammar that are not chunked. All right, last major evidence slide. Okay. Second language. So the one-liner is second language grammar depends on declarative memory early in learning, if the input is explicit or encourages chunking, and if you're better at declarative memory. So if Adolfo is better at declarative memory, he will learn a second language more here, and vice versa. Later in learning, without explicit or chunking input, and if you're better at procedural or worse at declarative. Okay, so first characteristics. So the characteristics of low experience L2 are like declarative memory, it's more effortful. Instructed L2, of course, has explicit knowledge. High experience L2 is more automatized, obviously. And uninstructed immersion L2 often results in implicit knowledge. This is now direct evidence. This is a different figure than I showed you before, but the same study. It's actually the same paper, 2018. But now this is second language grammar. And as you'll see when I blow this up, low experience L2 grammar, so early stages of learning a second language, grammatical abilities correlate only with declarative, not procedural memory. And high experience, it's the exact opposite, only with procedural, not declarative. Really, really nice. So this is the same paper, okay, but this is now only grammar, okay, at lower experience or grammar at high experience. Again, blue is declarative, red is procedural. At low experience, early stages of learning a second language, how good you are at grammar across syntax and morphology correlates with how good you are at an independent task on declarative memory and not at all procedural memory. And it switches. So when you're pretty good at learning a language, at later stages, also pretty good. Okay, it's 2 are a bit confounded, right? The grammar, how good your grammar is correlates with how good you are at finger tapping, which has been tied to procedural memory and not with declarative memory. So this really, really nicely ties grammar to declarative memory early on and then procedural memory. Now we finally look at functional neuroanatomy. So when you have lesions to frontal basal ganglia structures in stroke or in Parkinson's disease, that impairs, this is quite striking, grammar more in first than second language, and in high than low experience second language. This is striking because this is better known. Very often in damage, the thing that's weaker gets affected more. This is the stronger thing that's affected, the stronger thing that's more affected. And moreover, it's only for grammar. You don't find that for lexical abilities. That's pretty striking. I think more work needs to be done here, more studies, but there are increasing number of studies. So I'm somewhat convinced that this is real. In neuroimaging, if you have input in learning a language that promotes chunking or explicit knowledge, like explaining the rules of the language, that results in hippocampal activation, but not in the basal ganglia, not in the striatum. But then if you have input that doesn't do this, so now it's going to should shift to procedural memory, you get the anterior striatal activation, that's activation in the basal ganglia, and not in the hippocampus. That's what this is here. It's very cool. And then N400s, right? At low experience and instructed L2 is when you find N400s for grammar. But at high experience and uninstructed L2, you get a left anterior negativity. So only at low experience and instructed L2 do you have this N400, which is tied to declarative memory. Whereas at high experience and uninstructed L2, you get left anterior negativities, which may be tied to procedural memory. So you have the hippocampal activation tied to input to grammar that promotes chunking or explicit knowledge. So like the cat, or explaining the role. You don't get basal ganglia striatal activation. Here's an N400 at, I think this one's a high experience. And then you get basal ganglia activation, striatal activation when you don't get this chunking or explicit input. And here's a high experience left anterior negativity in for grammar and second language. All right. Final, last bit of evidence is developmental disorders. So this is a neurocognitive hypothesis, a hypothesis we first came up with in 2004, 2005. And then we published more recently on it as well. A lot of studies on this. This is just overview studies. It's called we call it the procedural circuit deficit hypothesis, or PDH. And basically, this says that it hypothesizes that various developmental disorders result, at least in part, from abnormalities of brain structures underlying procedural memory. So it's a neuroanatomical hypothesis. Whereas declarative memory remains relatively normal and compensates for these and other problems in the disorder as well. These I bit my tongue, sorry. My procedural memory isn't doing very well. These disorders explained by the PDH may include at least developmental language disorder, DLD, dyslexia, which is developmental reading disorder, developmental coordination disorder, which is developmental motor problems, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, math disability, probably others as well. And as we'll see, I actually only look at it for DLD today. The hypothesis can explain a wide range of behavioral and brain patterns in the disorders, and so a lot of these are comorbid, co-occurring with each other in certain combinations. This can also explain the comorbidities, at least may explain it, because it's the same circuitry that's affected, even somewhat differently in the different disorders. So let's focus on developmental language disorder, just a few slides, and we'll summarize and then do this other stuff that I mentioned, so new directions. Developmental language disorder, or DLD, is simply a developmental disorder of language in the absence of other problems. You can hear, right? The absence of hearing problems, absence of being locked in a closet with no linguistic input, absence of having your head cut off, right? So none of these things, well, you still have language problems, okay? Despite this kind of broad exclusionary definition, grammar is particularly affected across syntax, morphology, and phonetics. Not only, but in general, that's what you find. Note that DLD used to be called specific language impairment, or SLI. Okay? There's been a name change in the field. Previously, people said that it's due to grammar problems. Okay? It's like, oh, it's a grammar module. It's a problem with the grammar module, something like that. Other people said it was due to a processing deficit, like problem with working memory or executive function. Well, this can't explain this, and this has trouble explaining this. And plus, they're both kind of cognitive, functional explanations. I mean, obviously, DLD is based in the brain. It's not based in the kneecap or the foot or the gallbladder or the liver, right? So with that in mind, we proposed the PDH. So here's a bit more on the PDH than the previous slide, 2 slides ago. So according to the procedural deficit hypothesis, or PDH, DLD can be largely explained by abnormalities of brain structures. Remember, I said it's a neuroanatomical hypothesis that underlie procedural memory, especially in particular the basal ganglia and maybe the anterior striatum, possibly, right? Because it's involved in early stages of learning, so just maybe. These abnormalities should result in impairments of procedural memory and grammar, since grammar is hypothesized to belong in procedural memory for the most part, at least to higher levels of skill. But also, and this is a bit tricky, Also, we expect problems with this structure, the basal ganglia, to also affect other functions that depend on these structures, like working memory and executive function. It's not the case that the basal ganglia, including the anterior striatum, only does procedural memory. It's like saying my hand grasps, but my hand also does, picking and scratching and all kinds of things. If you smash my hand, I'm going to have problems with all of those. Maybe a little bit differently with each of them, but that's the idea here. And finally, these grammatical and other deficits will be at least partially compensated for by declarative memory. Here's the evidence. This is impaired. All this stuff that depends on the basal ganglia or procedural memory. Grammar learning, cross syntax and morphology and phonology, by the way. Procedural memory, so learning and procedural memory. This is this finger sequence learning thing I've mentioned a few times, the serial reaction time task. This is a meta-analysis we ran on various studies showing that, in fact, it's impaired in DLD. You don't have to, all you need to know is it's impaired. And there have been follow-up meta-analyses since then showing the same thing. Motor skills are impaired in DLD. Working memory is impaired, executive function is impaired. Pretty cool. In contrast, word processing and learning is relatively spared, not completely, and maybe not surprisingly not completely because it involves phonology as well. Irregular morphology is relatively spared. Argument structures and complements are relatively spared, and declarative memory is relatively spared. Here's a neuroanatomical meta-analysis that actually we just finished. So we sent it to Nature Neuroscience, and they were interested, but then they desk rejected it. They said, nah, it's not interesting enough. And now we have an email into Nature Human Behavior, and they haven't answered. It's been a week, so I don't know. I'll have to nudge them tomorrow or something.
No news is good news when it comes to submissions, isn't it?
I don't know. We'll see. So this basically is a neuroanatomical meta-analysis of all studies of abnormalities in DLD. And what we find is only the basal ganglia shows very high levels of abnormalities, only in the anterior striatum. Pretty damn cool. Pretty cool. And the medial temporal lobe is actually quite spared. And then finally, this compensation. People with DLD, kids with DLD use explicit rules like, add ED if it's yesterday. They memorize chunks. You can test this with so-called frequency effect analyses. And whereas in typical kids we saw before, words, lexical knowledge correlate with declarative memory and grammar with procedural memory, both of them correlate with declarative memory and not procedural memory, suggesting that grammar is compensated for by declarative memory. And moreover, grammar shows N400s in DLD, whereas in typical it's left anterior negativities. All right, that's the end of the evidence. I'm going to summarize, show the new directions, and then we're done. And then you can breathe. There's a lot of information. So what we've shown is that this converging behavioral, neurological, neuroimaging, electrophysiological, and endocrine evidence, and we're starting to get genetic evidence too now, that language depends on both learning and memory circuits, both declarative and procedural memory. But that lexical and grammatical knowledge depend differentially on the two circuits. But it's not all or none. It's a bit of a mix. The learning and processing of lexical word knowledge depends heavily on declarative memory, particularly for content words like nouns and verbs or irregular morphological forms. But also aspects of lexical learning and processing depend on procedural memory, word segmentation, closed class words, and motor words, at least to some extent, okay, like Hammer. Grammatical rule knowledge depends heavily on procedural memory, particularly for syntax, morphology, also phonology, but also, to a fair extent, on declarative memory as a function of input, subject, and item factors. This is the redundancy that I was talking about. Right? So there's less input, it depends on declarative. Grammar depends on declarative memory. Explicit input, we've seen this now. Or subject differences. If you're good at declarative memory, right? Like if you're female or you're a young adult, second language learner, or bad at procedural memory, such as a young adult second language learner compared to a child, or if you have developmental language disorder, or high frequency chunks like walk or the cat. So this is what we've looked at today and summarized here is just a small proportion of the predictions that the DP model makes, right? Which are much richer, including genetics, for example. And so there are many, many gaps to be examined. Here, I'll just look briefly at a few other topics. speech sound representation seem to be actually tied to both the procedural and declarative memory, including the brain structures. This is a big new area for us. We're looking at aging effects. And so we've hypothesized that lexical declines in aging, especially lexical production, so picture naming, retrieving forms from meanings, okay, may be explained in part at least by declines in declarative memory, especially hippocampus, right? Particularly for recalling form from meaning, because that's recalling recollection of that association, especially for recently learned words that you've learned later in life because they haven't undergone systems consolidation based on dependent hippocampus. So we call this the declarative aging deficit or DAD hypothesis. I'm a father, and I can say dad predicts or according to dad, so it makes me happy. Very silly. And we're also looking at genetics for this. So we actually have found that this ApoE gene, okay, actually the bad version of it causes declines more in lexical production than the good version. Pretty damn cool, right? So, one way of thinking about this, like if you got excited and positive about it, it's like this is a new gene for language, right? Depending how you think about it, right? It's kind of true, right? And then finally, there are educational and therapeutic implications because we know a lot about how to improve learning and retention in these memory systems, behavioral, pharmacological, and so on. And so you can apply those to second language learning or to disorders, and we're starting to do that. Like the spacing effect or the testing effect, okay, things like that, which enhance learning in declarative memory, and then it enhances word learning, for example. And then finally, I'll just wrap up quickly. This is basically, look, if these memory circuits have been co-opted, hijacked for language, shouldn't it be the same for other cognitive domains like reading or math? That's what we're doing now. So there's correlational evidence we published or is under review showing that for reading and math. And we've argued that dyslexia may be explained by the PDH, by procedural problems, and same perhaps with math disability. That's it. And that's how you guys feel.
Thank you so much, Michael. Fascinating. It just makes one wonder when you're going to write the book about all of this.
I've been delaying that for like 10 years, 15 years. I always, my field, like your field too, I think, I don't know for your our subfields, articles are more important than books. So it's easier.
Absolutely. But, that's a good thing because here I have a compilation of questions. Some of them have popped up via Zoom. We have some others coming from through a WhatsApp group that we have, and a couple of my own. I'm also mindful of everybody's time, so I'm just going to choose a couple of them, if that's okay, Michael.
Absolutely.
But one of them is the following: if you go back to the early postulations of the model, many changes have. I can detect many changes. I was saying that it's a good thing that maybe you have not written that book 10 or 15 years ago because so much has happened, and that book would have looked much different from what it will be next year when you actually write it. But one of the things that I noticed is that the model has become substantially less dichotomical than it was at first. It seemed to be that there was a very strict and demarcated division of labor between procedural and declarative memory systems in the 2001 rendition of the model, if you will. I was wondering what prompted, first of all, if you think that this impression is correct, and if so, what prompted this change? Was it new evidence? Was it the reappraisal of previous evidence, or was it just more of a notional, conceptual sort of epiphany you had?
Yeah. So I think this is a great question, Adolfo, and it's particularly, maybe useful for, students and younger scientists who sort of as to how science works, right? So, you have an idea, and as I said before, most hypotheses and ideas are wrong in science, right? And, our human brains are pretty simple in most circumstances. We make simple categories, simple ideas, and so on. And then the more time we think about it and the more evidence comes in that might be not exactly consistent with that or even inconsistent with that, then you think, well, wait, what's going on? This doesn't make sense, right? Wait, they can do both things, or it's not just grammar here, or whatever it is, right? And then you gradually modify it. And so I think, I view that as a very good thing, right? Because there's no way you're gonna get it right the first time. It's impossible, right? And so it's, I think, both things you said. It's kind of learning about the systems independently and looking at evidence, my own and other evidence too. It's not just my own. So, one of the things I do, one of the kinds of papers I write are what I call theory papers, like the procedural deficit hypothesis, where I kind of put everything together, mostly from the broader literature, and then try to explain it. Not just it's not like I run every experiment myself.
That is beautiful, and it is such a valuable and understated lesson. And especially when you have postulations published in very high-profile journals or in very nice-looking books. Sometimes you approach those works, especially when you are just starting your trajectory in academia as a student or whatever it might be, as revelations, as truths. And science is not the realm of truth.
Exactly.
If that's what you're pursuing, then maybe venture into religion or something else, right?
Yeah.
But that is beautiful. Here's a curveball for you, Michael. How do you account for actual dissociations between procedural and morphosyntactic skills? I mean, sometimes, even in cases of severe non-fluent aphasia, be it stroke-induced or primary progressive aphasia in its non-fluent variant, sometimes several procedural skills are relatively preserved while morphosyntax is severely impaired. So does the model contemplate for how this may occur, perhaps microanatomically or by way of some other mechanisms?
So, I can always hand wave and say, well, different parts of it are affected or something like that. But I think the most interesting answer, which is probably going to be true a lot of the time, is that we have to be, and many people I work with, let alone people I don't work with, get confused or forget about this. Remember that to a fair extent, not completely, but to a fair extent, different parts of the brain, different structures within the procedural circuit are involved in learning and in processing afterwards. So if you think of, remember what these are, right? The basal ganglia, in particular, the caudate and putamen, base of the striatum, in particular, the anterior parts of those, is involved in learning new stuff, new skills, right? Or new grammar, right? But then someone who's aphasic, right? If I have brain damage now, I've learned this stuff, right? And so if you test my procedural memory, that's learning. So I've never liked the term procedural memory. I can't change it because it's too ingrained in literature, but it's procedural learning. I use that term a few times in the talk. It's learning. It's learning this new sequence, right, of using your fingers. And so someone with damage to premotor or ventral premotor, Broca's area, Brodmann's 44, frontal operculum, or parietal, posterior temporal parietal regions, and so on, that is more likely to affect already learned grammatical skills than the learning of skills, which is what people mean when they say procedural learning. Now, it may affect already learned skills. That's what you get when you get ideomotor apraxia, right? So you can't, and that's associated with inferior parietal as well as prefrontal. As frontal motor regions, sorry, which makes sense. Okay. Whereas something, a condition like developmental language disorder, which has associated with, as we saw, impairments, abnormalities in the basal ganglia, anterior striatum in particular, apparently, they show problems learning new sequences and new grammar, which is what appears to be the case.
Thank you. That's first thing I appreciate in your reply is the circumventing the easy way out of there may be some sub-regions, and that's a really good way of framing it with implications for thinking about basically the whole of functional neuroanatomy, because there's not a single brain region that is just concerned with only one function anywhere in the brain. So your focus is on the overlaps, if you will, the functional overlaps between broadly defined procedural and declarative functions and the more particularly defined lexicosemantic and morphosyntactic features, but this is just like a manifestation of a more general principle of neurocognition, right? That of hijacking or recycling or grounding, in whichever guys you may want to think about it. Let me go to the Zoom chat here
By the
and choose
way,
one of.
I never, until you just said it now, I never thought or realized that when, people who study stuff like you, and they use the word grounding, it never occurred to me until you just said it, that is, you can think of grounding in terms of co-optation or recycling.
It's one of the ways in which you can think about it. Some people emphasize more the notion of simulations. There are different ways of thinking about it, but if you this is just my particular flavor
I think
of it.
you're right. I think that's one way. I think you're right. I didn't until you said it. I didn't think about it that way.
That is the way, perhaps because of my own sort of embodied bias. That's the way in which I've always thought about your model. Let me tell you.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Okay,
going
well,
onto the Zoom chat here. Let me choose one of these questions. If we learn a new language and we don't practice it for a long time, which memory system will be more affected? Will the vocabulary that we don't practice be forgotten, or will that memory system be eventually able to recall it?
Maybe a couple of answers. So one is, if you've learned it, those aspects that the extent that you've learned stuff only in declarative memory or also in procedural memory may affect how much you retain it, since retention is better in procedural than declarative memory. So if you've only learned words or early stages of grammar in declarative memory, you're probably going to lose a lot. Whereas in procedural memory, if you already learned it to the point of proceduralizing, learning stuff in procedural memory, then you might forget less, just like you don't forget your native language, right? Or well-learned second language. You might forget the words, but you don't forget, like you pick it up pretty quickly once you're, the grammar and prosody and stuff. So the other thing that's a bit tricky is, so we have, I guess, one paper where with an artificial language, we taught people Brocanto 2. We looked at their ERPs, and we found a left anterior negativity for the grammar at later stages. Right? So it's kind of consistent with what I've been saying. And then we tested them, I can't remember now, 4 to 6 months later, 3 to 6 months later or something. And we actually found, with a little bit of warm-up practice, it wasn't cold, right? But, like 10 minutes or something. We actually found stronger left anterior negativities. And so what we think was going on was consolidation. So you have loss, but you might also have consolidation, and those two are kind of two sides, opposing a little bit.
Beautiful. Here's another one. There are a couple of good ones here. What about other linguistic systems? Does your model account for prosody, pragmatics?
So I think it'll account for some of it. So in this the systematic review that Morgan Short et al. 2022 that I showed you, those two bar graphs for lexical memory being more tied to declarative and procedural memory. I think this was in the final version of the chapter. We also looked at other aspects, even beyond lexicon and grammar, morphosyntax, phonology, and so on. I think we had something on pragmatics in there too. So I've not really looked at that. I don't remember if it's still in the chapter. I can't remember if we kept it in. But, the way I think about this is, as I said early on in the talk, anything that has to be learned is going to be learned somehow. And then stuff is recycled, co-opted, hijacked, grounded, or whatever, right? Then, and because these two learning circuits are the two most important ones, there are others as well, right? So it's not just that everything has to be learned there, right? The neocortex can learn on its own to some extent, although probably not new stuff from scratch. I've kind of ignored the cerebellum, that does some learning, but basically the idea is that whatever we learn has to be learned somehow, and it'll probably happen in a system that's already good at learning, so co-optation. And if it's not entirely or largely in these two circuits, it might be in another circuit.
Thank you. I'm suppressing the follow-up questions I have, just to be respectful.
Your executive inhibitory ability.
I mean, you have no idea. Okay, can I press you for a quick yes or no? And then you can elaborate, but I will press you for a yes or no answer to this one. So are these functional specializations proposed by the model, are they proposed to be universal? That is to say, valid across all of the world's languages and language families?
Oh, universal in language, not universal language and non-language. Universal
in language across the 7,000 of languages.
In the kind of Chomsky sense or whatever, yeah. Yeah, but every language will have different characteristics and may depend on different, amount to the two on the two systems. So, for example, an agglutinative language like Turkish, where you have so many different suffixes and they're combined in different ways, you're going to not be able to chunk very much because I think, right, this is what I predict, right, because you don't hear, walked, you hear a lot, so you can just memorize it. You can't do that for as easily, right, as likely for when you have many affixes in different orders and different positions all the time, right? So then you would expect that morphology, for example, in Turkish would depend more on procedural memory and less on declarative memory because you don't chunk as easily. So, but yeah, I think what the question's really getting at is, yeah, I think that these things are going to be at play in probably all, I think, a strongest, all languages, but it's going to be different to some extent for every language.
Fantastic. And maybe one final question, and thanks to you, Michael, and to everybody for sticking here with us despite the technical difficulties we had. And so here's a final one for you. Your model, amidst other mainstream language models, stands out by its emphasis on subcortical regions.
Correct.
I mean, if I go over some of the other highly cited language models, they're pretty much cortical. I mean, they're pretty much neocortical.
Yeah, like Hickok and Preppel, dorsal ventral stream.
Absolutely.
Angela Frieda-Rizzi. No, Angela Frieda-Rizzi talks a little bit about basic ganglia, but mostly they're cortical.
Yeah, well, the MUC model, memory unification control, does make some reference to basal ganglia circuits and whatnot. But it's not so vital, so central to it as it seems to be in your case. So. Do you agree with this sweeping statement about other models? And if so, what are those other models missing out on?
I'll give a one-word answer. Learning. None of those models are about learning. At least most of them.
Enough said. Beautiful.
And these structures, they don't only do learning, right? The basal ganglia has all kinds of stuff, working memory and executive function and so on, right? But if you don't focus on learning, you don't need learning-based structures as much. Whereas what we're trying to do here is we're focusing on learning, but as if you notice, if you notice my first sentence in the first slide, I said, increasing evidence suggests that the learning, representation, and processing of first and second language depend on these systems, right? So we're focusing on learning, but really we're looking at the whole circuit, right? When I talked about the circuits, I talked about neocortex and how it's doing, how it's binding stuff and so on and so forth. So I think of it as the entire circuit, but the focus is still on learning, whereas the other ones don't look at learning at all or very little.
Beautiful. And we're having this conversation via Zoom, and remote calls, are just a blessing in a way. It's what's given us the chance to listen to you today, which has been remarkable for our series. But it also has its downsides, because trust me, if we were live here, I mean, more than one of us would be right now, after the talk's over, just stalking you, surrounding you, and taking up the rest of your day with more questions. For one,
we can also eat good food that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that the way, the justa via media for this will be, let's follow up on this at some later time with another call. This has been phenomenal. The amount of work and the pluralistic view you have, and the constructive view you set forth by really not just sort of insisting on a model, but just developing the model, is instructive on its own. So thank you very much, Michael. It's been a pleasure. Final words, if you will.
No, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your insights, and I'm learning from you too, and like the grounding thing and the things you've said. I look forward to talking with you more. Thank you for your feedback on that other paper that we're going to be doing together, I think. Yeah, I guess the last thing you said, I think I would emphasize again, let's not forget, everybody, that we're mostly wrong, right? So, in this case, it means, it's resulted in me changing the model and making more complexities and adding genetics and this and that, and, making it more subtle and stuff like that. In other cases, might have been totally wrong. There are certain things I've proposed that I think are completely wrong. I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Ironically, and I hope that the linguists in the audience don't take this the wrong way, but ironically, that I think that in some fields, there's more of a resistance to being wrong than others. And I think it's partly related to how strong the evidence is. When there's very clear evidence, I think you just have to change your mind, right? Whereas I think more in the social sciences, where the evidence is a bit trickier, I think it's easier to keep your opinions. So it's good to remember. Oh, one last thing I wanted to do is talk about subcortical structures. We have a paper we published a few months ago that basically, I probably sent it to you, I think, Adolfo.
I read it. I read it before it was published. The one on the cerebellum, was it below the?
Yes. It's the title. I love the title. We called it Subcortical Cognition: The Fruit Below the Rind.
Yep. Beautiful.
Below cortex, and so this is not about my model at all, right? But basically, it's saying, look, like to your question, right, before, subcortical structures are much more important than we think. Not just the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, but throughout the brain. And I think it's good for us to remember that and to pay attention to that, not just to cortex.
Absolutely, no, and you're right. So the focus is not on the cerebellum there, but we did cite it in a paper we just published in Philosophical Transactions, linking the cerebellum and cerebellar cortical connections to processing of specific conceptual categories, social concepts. So just to reciprocate, I'll send that to you, and
Yes.
Your feedback would be much appreciated.
And then I'll be talking to you soon in this include.
Yes, absolutely. Right. Thank you so much again, Michael.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks everybody in the audience till our next lecture.
And
Bye-bye.
Thank you for your patience given the length of this session. Bye, everybody.